Hello, my name is Madison Brown, and today we will be discussing why bad policies exist and how they are perpetuated. I will be analyzing the Controlled Substance Act as it pertains to the classification of marijuana as a Schedule I drug. This act contends that under federal law, the sale and consumption of marijuana is illegal, as the substance is considered highly addictive and without medical value. Certainly, cannabis has been prominent in the news lately as more states vote to legalize it for both recreational and medical purposes. Yet despite growing public support for its legalization, the federal law remains. As such, public choice theory can help us understand why this occurs. So what exactly is public choice? Broadly, it is the economics of political behavior. For the sake of this case study, we will narrow the definition to a school of thought that focuses on the way that politics applies laws and regulations to meet the demands of interest groups. These special interest groups are in the business of protecting and advancing their interests via lobbying and campaign contributions to politicians who facilitate such goals. Accordingly, this means that good policies that harm certain interest groups are unlikely to be supported by politicians whose goals are facilitated by the same special interest groups. But more on that later. Now, let's look at the history of marijuana in the United States. Marijuana was not widely used for recreational purposes in this country until the early 1900s. As people immigrated from Mexico to the United States during the Mexican Revolution, they introduced the recreational practice of smoking marijuana to American culture. As massive unemployment and social unrest grew during the Great Depression, Americans began to resent Mexican immigrants. This drove the association between these immigrants and the evil weed they brought to America. Public fear increased, resulting in 29 states outlawing cannabis by 1931. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 was the first federal U.S. law to criminalize marijuana nationwide. The act imposed an excise tax on the sale, possession, or transfer of all hemp products, effectively criminalizing all but industrial uses of the plant. However, by 1960, marijuana had regained popularity. It was used widely among college students and hippies and became a symbol of rebellion against authority. In retaliation, President Richard Nixon signed the Controlled Substance Act of 1970 into law. This act repealed the Marijuana Tax Act and listed marijuana as a Schedule I drug.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
In June 1971, President Nixon declared a war on drugs. He dramatically increased the size and presence of federal drug control agencies and pushed through measures such as mandatory sentencing and no-knock warrants. So why were such draconian measures implemented? A top Nixon aide, John Ehrlichman, later admitted, quote, "You want to know what this was really all about. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or blacks, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." The presidency of Ronald Reagan marked the start of a lengthy period of skyrocketing rates of incarceration, primarily attributed to his unprecedented expansion of the drug war. The number of people behind bars for nonviolent drug law offenses increased from 50,000 in 1980 to over 400,000 by 1997. The era of George W. Bush also witnessed the rapid escalation of the militarization of domestic drug law enforcement. By the end of Bush's term, there were about 40,000 paramilitary-style SWAT raids on Americans every year, mostly for nonviolent drug law offenses, often misdemeanors. Today, 700,000 people are arrested for marijuana offenses each year. Arrests continue despite the marijuana reform that has swept the nation. States such as Alaska, California, Colorado, Nevada, Oregon, Maine, Massachusetts, Washington State, and Washington, D.C. have legalized marijuana for adults. Looking at the scientific evidence of the criminalization of the drug, we find marijuana is far less harmful to human health than most other banned drugs. It is also less dangerous than the other highly addictive but perfectly legal substances known as alcohol and tobacco. Marijuana cannot lead to a fatal overdose. Its addictive properties, while present, are low, and the myth that it leads users to more powerful drugs has long since been disproved.
If you find a positive effect, then that justifies drilling down deeper and deeper to see where this positive effect is coming from. There's quite a bit of evidence that suggested that cannabis would be useful for a number of indications.
Migraine and nausea and vomiting.
Marijuana contains anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, and probably anti-cancer compounds.
This data does not suggest that marijuana is not harmless. It can produce a serious dependency, and constant use would interfere with job and school performance. It needs to be kept out of the hands of minors. But, on balance, the downsides are not reasons to impose criminal penalties on its possession, particularly in a society that permits nicotine use and celebrates drinking. Moreover, according to an Institute of Medicine study, marijuana, quote, does not appear to be a gateway drug to the extent that it is the cause or even that it is the most significant predictor of serious drug abuse. The real gateway drugs are tobacco and alcohol, which young people turn to first before trying marijuana. Public opinion also reflects a call for its decriminalization. 2/3 of Americans say the use of marijuana should be legal, reflecting a steady increase over the past decade. An overwhelming 91% say marijuana should be legal either for medical or recreational use, and fewer than 8% prefer to keep it illegal in all circumstances. Even among politicians, 68% of Democrats and 49% of Republicans say marijuana should be legal for both medical and recreational use. So, given mass incarceration, the relative safety of the drug, and a public opinion favoring its decriminalization, why does the federal government still have this law and enforce it? Why does this policy not reflect the opinion of the American public? Is this a failure in American democracy? Put simply, this bad policy exists because it's in the interest of government officials. And what makes it in the interest of government officials? Interest groups. An interest group is an organized group of individuals that make policy-related appeals to the government. There are two main things interest groups do when interacting with government. First, they try to shape policies, which they can do by mobilizing voters or by putting direct pressure on elected officials in Congress through providing contributions, support, and information. Second, they provide information that is too costly or too difficult for elected officials to obtain on their own. This is how interest groups exert pressure on the bureaucracy, as these agencies are often too poorly funded to spend the resources gathering information. Interest groups may also write the bills that become laws. However, this is more likely to occur on state and local levels where lawmakers do not have the resources to research bills. Highly regulated industries have a great interest in seeing the legislation they want passed. They also have a lot of money, certainly more than any federal agency, which they can spend on research and information for these bureaucratic agencies. Moreover, many interest groups spend just as much effort lobbying bureaucratic agencies as Congress, so they can write regulations that work in their favor. So, why do interest groups exist? Doesn't this all seem a little shady? Well, there's a PPE term known as interest group pluralism, and it serves as a mechanism of social choice. Interest group pluralism asserts that if all interest groups are free to compete to influence officials, they will balance each other out. This was conceptualized by James Madison in the Federalist Papers. Madison argued for extending the sphere in American politics and encouraging more factions. The theory was that the more groups there were, the less likely that any one group could gain a corrupting influence over the government. Interest group pluralism utilizes the wisdom of the crowds and Condorcet's jury as ways to make judgments. As more interest groups provide more information, we will get policies that are the result of thoughtful compromise. Interest groups offer more opportunities for participation in politics. However, in reality, interest group politics actually diminish American democracy because some interest groups are so powerful that their voices can crowd out the others. These interest groups are run by wealthy corporations who have more money, are better educated, and have more time to devote to political participation. Let's look at the interest group involvement in the federal laws criminalizing marijuana. There are 5 primary industries, each represented by numerous different interest groups. The first industry is the Boys in Blue. The National Fraternal Order of Police, National Association of Police Organizations, Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, as well as dozens of smaller interest groups represent the interests of law enforcement officers. Local law enforcement has become highly dependent on federal and state money devoted to the war on drugs. Civil asset forfeiture allows local police departments to keep 80% of property seized in suspected, not proven, drug activity. Property is auctioned off to pay for military-grade equipment and SWAT teams. For this industry, the nation's marijuana policy means guaranteed revenue, low-risk peaceful offenders to fill arrest quotas, and easy excuses to search or detain citizens. The next industry is Big Brother, aka the prison industrial complex. It includes interest groups such as Association of Administrative Law Judges, American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, and GEO Group Incorporated. These interest groups represent private prison companies and state institutions alike and lobby for longer mandatory sentences, stricter enforcement, and younger, healthier, and less violent prisoners. Marijuana offenders fit this profile. Prisons contract for an occupancy rate and charge taxpayers for unmet quotas. Thus, due to the frequency of marijuana sale and consumption, these quotas become quite easy to meet if the substance remains federally illegal. The next industry is Big Pharma. It is represented by interest groups such as Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, Eli Lilly and Company, Express Scripts, Merck and Company, and AstraZeneca plc. Before President Ford shut down cannabis research at universities, scientists had noticed its effectiveness in reducing seizures and relieving pain. Specialized strains are developed to treat depression, anxiety, nausea, Parkinson's, and other common conditions for which patients currently take patented pills. Pharmaceutical industry products are expensive and may have life-altering side effects. Conversely, cannabis can be grown by the patient and has far fewer and less severe side effects. Accordingly, these interest groups benefit from the current federal law as it prevents substitution for their products from entering the market. Another industry is Big Booze. It is represented by interest groups such as the National Beer Wholesalers Association and Wine and Spirits Wholesalers of America. Marijuana prohibition prevents cannabis from competing with alcohol. In states that have legalized marijuana, alcohol sales have been reduced. Thus, this is a legitimate concern for the industry. Big Booze invested $19 million to anti-marijuana legalization election campaigns in 2016 and another $4 million to soft money groups like Public Safety First, which specifically oppose legalization efforts. Evidently, marijuana criminalization is profitable for numerous corporations, and the interest groups that represent these corporations ensure that this policy perpetuates. But perhaps the largest industry, and therefore the one that has the most to lose, is big government. Big government is represented by interest groups such as the American Federation of Government Employees and National Active and Retired Federal Employees. Marijuana prohibition is a $20 billion annual federal jobs project. The Drug Enforcement Administration seized $27 billion in assets in 2014 through its Cannabis Enforcement Program, which is exceedingly more than its $3 billion annual budget. The expansive war on drugs funds 10,000 DEA employees, 63,000 federal prison system employees, border guards, and thousands more interagency positions, and they don't want to see their budget downsized or authority curtailed. So, what would life in the U.S. look like if government officials enacted a policy that reflected the views of the American public instead of industries? Keeping with our cannabis case study, let's look at some implications of federal marijuana legalization. Legalization would reduce racially skewed marijuana arrests and eliminate a black market for cannabis that helps fund criminal activity around the world, thus moving the trade from drug cartels to legal businesses that can be better regulated. Moreover, since marijuana would now be a regulated commodity, it would also be taxable by the federal government. A federal excise tax on cannabis could generate an additional $500 million annually. States where marijuana is already legal enjoy enormous benefits. Cannabis sales allow them to allocate their law enforcement resources better, generate new tax revenue, and decrease incarceration rates of nonviolent offenders. Over 650,000 Americans are still arrested annually across the country for marijuana-related offenses. These arrests consume law enforcement and judicial resources that can be better utilized combating violent crime. States that legalize and regulate marijuana effectively end the practice of arresting otherwise law-abiding cannabis consumers and immediately reap the social and financial benefits from stopping arrests. So, back to our original question. Why do bad policies exist, and how are they perpetuated? The answer boils down to three things: votes, money, and interest groups. Government officials rely on interest groups for contributions and electoral support, and in turn, interest groups ensure the legislation that benefits their industry is passed. In no way is this intended to be a call for federal marijuana legalization. Instead, it is a PPE explanation of a public choice problem in the context of this case study. The classification of marijuana as a Schedule I drug is one bad policy among many in the United States. Consequently, this case study has been an enlightening look at the behind-the-scenes aspects of politics and an explanation as to why public opinion does little to influence policy.
Sweet marijuana, marijuana, help me in my distress. Sweet marijuana, please do. You alone can bring my lover back.